I want to talk to you over the next 10 to 15 minutes about analyzing qualitative data. So we've spent quite a bit of time talking about the qualitative approach, talking about certain research designs you would use when you want to examine subjective experiences of your participants, when you want to better understand processes and outcomes from a social standpoint. Okay, so we said the two primary ways to collect data are through interviews and observations, and then as you gather the textual information, you need to make sense of it. This is where qualitative data analysis helps. So this sort of tongue-in-cheek quote here says, the person who knows how will always have a job, and the person who knows why will always be his or her boss. Yeah, this is a bit sarcastic or cheeky, but the point is, in the qualitative approach, the whole purpose is to understand why something is happening and what are the processes involved. So remember that as we start analyzing data, that you're really getting at what is the reality here that you're investigating for its participants. So notice the differences between qualitative and quantitative approaches. Qualitative approaches, they blend evidence, data, and abstract concepts in the form of textual information in order to explain or interpret social phenomena, social processes, okay? Not necessarily objective numeric things, but still, even though a qualitative approach doesn't collect numbers and use statistical analyses, it is still systematic. It still seeks truth and wants to avoid error or bias, but it's just a different approach. So a couple of things that you need to understand in terms of the big picture. The qualitative approach will involve going back and forth from your data into your conclusions and then by a process of analysis. So you're going back and forth to maybe your field guide if you're doing an observational study, or to your transcripts from your interviews. So and then maybe as you analyze 5 transcripts, you're even going out to interview another participant. And then you're collecting more data, then you're analyzing that new interview in light of the previous 5 or 6 interviews, and then you're trying to summarize the data in order to make sense of the textual information that you have, okay? So this process, again, is seeking to make sense of and explain subjective processes or phenomena. How do we do this? Well, we prepare the data for analysis through reducing just the volume of information you have. Then you can conduct your analyses to go deeper. Remember, the term we often use is that any theory that you arrive at through your analysis should be grounded in your data. So it's a grounded theory. Then you figure out this final step is how will you represent your data. Often we'll use visual maps or concept maps in order to give high-level interpretation of the data. Okay, so 3 processes that you will be going through as a group. At the end of this at the end of this talk, there will be an assignment in Blackboard. You are kind of broken into 3 groups. Remember, some of you are in the fitness intervention study. Some of you are in the leadership study of athletic directors, and some of you are in the perceptions of the body study. You're going to be going through these 3 processes, okay? You're going to reduce the data that you have on your transcripts, then you're going to start to work through the analysis process, otherwise known as coding, and then you're going to draw conclusions and hopefully represent those visually. Okay, let's briefly talk through each of these 3 ongoing activities. So basically, after you've conducted interviews or made your observations right here from however many participants you're going to observe or interview, then you begin to form categories based on the type of textual information you get from your observations or from your interviews, okay? You start with basic first order categories where you chunk the information and you code it. I'll show you what that means quickly. But the point is you keep working up the ladder here to a deeper and deeper understanding of the information you get down here at this lower level. Finally, you're trying to provide inductive theory or generalizations that are, again, all these themes or generalizations need to be grounded in the data you collect through your questions or observations. So, another guiding thought here as we get ready to go through those steps of qualitative data analysis, I'm constantly trying to be aware of my bias to force data into ready-made, convenient categories. And I want to make sure that I don't rush ahead and basically find what I expected to find. Okay? The purpose is to make sense out of the data, not necessarily to go directly to what I expect to find, and basically then all I'm doing would be confirming my own bias. I need to be careful not to do that and not to rush into that. Here's an example of, I'm going to show you kind of the, we'll work from the end and then we'll go backwards. Okay, so this is just a basic example of a study that was done. It looks like in golfers where, I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. This is basically what the final product looks like, okay? You work from raw data themes, basic codes that you establish from your transcripts or observations. So these are the basic units of analyses or categories. Then I build the first order themes. Then I build the second and general themes. This is my higher level theory, okay? So this might be basic quotes, and then first order themes might be comparing and contrasting quotes to find patterns, and then these final general dimensions or second order themes involve an ongoing analysis, a back and forth analysis where I can represent what's going on through a concept map. So step number one, how do I prepare and organize the data? I need to figure out how to sort and arrange the data into different source types. Okay, so are they observations? Are they interviews? Are they other content? And then I start to develop a general sense of the data. I scan all the transcripts to get general ideas that all the participants are conveying, and then maybe some potential differences among participants. One person says one thing, but 3 people say something different. So I start to visually scan the material to look for patterns and the general tone of the ideas that are being conveyed. Often I'll keep reflective notes on the side as I visually scan the material and get a general idea of what the participants are saying. I also want to make sure I'm reflecting, and maybe I'm saying, make sure to check all the male transcripts versus female, because it seems like they might be answering different based on gender. That's just an example. I could use anything, but make sure you have reflective notes in this process so that you can go back to it and better explain the data that's going on. Step number 3 in data analysis, I want to start coding the data into chunks or categories, okay? So this is the first step of, this is the first step after just reducing the data, the complexity of the transcripts, and this is the first legitimate step that will turn into analysis, okay? This is called coding. Basically, I'm trying to name or label or categorize concepts that come up over and over again. So I'm developing codes or labels that will become first order themes and higher order themes that help to provide a sense of what's going on in my phenomenon that I'm studying. Okay? These can be words, these can be sentence fragments, they can be thoughts, and maybe even sometimes paragraphs. So I'm working with the data to reduce it and begin to analyze it. There's no one way to code. You'll notice the first time you start playing around with the data that I've given you in your groups, it'll feel kind of weird. You're not sure how to proceed. That's okay. There's no one way to code. The point is you establish codes that begin to make sense of your data and to begin to categorize it. So a couple different ways that we code. First is called open coding, and just as the name implies, I'll take most, if not all, of my transcripts, or most, if not all, of my observational sheets, and I'll just get a sense of the whole. I'll rapidly read all the transcripts. I'll jot preliminary ideas down. What do they have in common? What seems to be categories, feelings, emotions, processes that are commonly expressed. I'm just jotting down things that jump out on a regular basis, okay? And I'm also starting to take a look at how these topics relate back to my question. Do they help explain some facet of my research question or my purpose statement, right? And so obviously here I'm making reflective notes about how they help or relate or explain some element of the research question. So I can list these emerging topics according to causes. For example, when I ask about, I don't know, the influence of family on these subjects, they always have the emotion of their response increases. Interesting. So question about parents causes an increase in emotion. Or the context. When the boss is in the room, I tend to get more generic answers, but when the boss is out of the room, I get more specific. So see, those I'm talking to you a little bit more about the reflective notes that you might write. But I could also list codes according to causes or context or conditions, or processes like the decision-making process for a point guard on a basketball team, right? There are 3 choices, but yet this point guard seems to use the pass option regularly, so passing becomes a category. I'm just giving examples of how you might look to find these codes in your preliminary analysis. For example, so this is a study on intrinsic motivation. What motivates people to participate in sport or music? And as this author read their transcripts, this idea of love came into discussion 13 times. So n equals number of occurrences. And then they use one quote to support this number 13. So this is a quote taken from a transcript. Just that I love playing. I just like playing sport. Right? So there are 13 examples where someone mentions this affection for playing sport. So the key code here would be love. And then they have a supporting quote just to show this is an initial code in the open coding process, right? An initial category that helps to explain an idea that was communicated a lot by the participants. Enjoy, fun, all codes that seek to begin to explain this phenomenon of motivation in sport. So you get the idea. Open coding is the initial, seeking to initially explain what's going on. What categories are repeated regularly. Axial coding is the next step. This is where you go deeper into specific documents and you're looking for more precise explanations of what's going on here. So what's the meaning that's being communicated? So this is a deeper level of analysis, a higher level of coding, where you're getting to more general themes. So I'm organizing specific data from the previous codes into a higher level of explanation. Basically, I'm creating new categories if one piece of data for my transcript doesn't fit into the previous codes that I made through the open coding process. And then I repeat this more in-depth level of analysis for several documents. Let me show you a quick example here of what I mean. So let's just say here's a study on exploring team identity in college sport. I just made this up real quick before shooting the video. Let's say I want to know how collegiate sports teams identify themselves and build a team identity. What processes do they use to build, team cohesion and a sense that people are a part of the team? Okay, so let's say I interview people and I observe, and then I start writing out all the transcripts from the interviews, and then I start the coding process to make sense of this idea called team identity in college sport. And let's say in the open coding process, I see that 5 people mentioned drinking, right? Well, we always go out on Saturday nights. Saturday nights, always go out. What do? We drink. And they mentioned drinking in excess. Well, I might create this code called binge drinking, and I might just put it along the side of the transcripts, okay? And then let's say several people talk about going on a retreat weekend in the preseason, and what a big deal that was for feeling a sense of oneness with their teammates, okay? And you get the idea. Maybe there's an orientation week. Everybody has to go through a hell week, 2-a-days, and that brings the team together. Everybody's got to go through it. Then there's the team trust fall. I don't know. So in the open coding process, I'm just looking to funnel my transcript data into specific codes that seek to make sense of this thing called team identity at a basic level. But then I get into the axial coding process, and now I'm trying to understand these codes at a deeper level. Well, what about binge drinking leads to team identity? And is it a good team identity or a bad team identity, right? How do these processes, Hell Week orientation, group exercises, lead to this creation of team identity? Well, do they all lead to good team identity or bad team identity? And is every experience the same? Well, in the axial coding process, as I go deeper into, let's say, individual transcripts, now I start to see that every mention of binge drinking tends to be said with negative emotions or connotations. I don't know. So then I might build a higher code of negative team experience. And all the team trust fall and group exercises and physical training, every time those are mentioned, maybe it's more positive experience, and these student athletes are giving positive emotions every time they talk about those codes. Well, then I might jot down a positive experience in the axial phase. And then I might jot down something called hazing process. If it seems like teams are engaged in binge drinking, let's say only certain players are engaged in binge drinking. Let's say the freshmen have to binge drink while the juniors and seniors don't. Ooh, now I'm starting to say there appears to be a hazing process in place where juniors and seniors are dictating what freshmen and sophomores do, and I call that hazing process. Versus team building, let's say I find that the coaching staff implements team building processes like the trust fall and orientation week, and so I might call these positive experiences or team building processes. Do you see what I'm doing? I'm building from specific categories of behaviors into more general explanations of what's going on. Okay? Now, in the final phase of data analysis, I'm trying to go deeper into the data to look for patterns, relationships, and even contradictions. For example, from my previous point, is it always the case that when the student athletes engage in negative experiences, is it always the case that they feel a sense of lower team identity? Or does it only depend on the situation and who's is it only when it's a hazing negative experience? So I'm looking for contradictions, and I'm looking for a higher pattern and relationship among the data. So I'm constantly reducing my list of topics, categories, or codes to show relationships. And then finally, I'm getting at maybe the big 3 to 7 categories that just become the major findings of the study, okay? These are the major themes. This is the theory that's grounded in the data. So after I've played with my data for a while, and I've searched for negative cases or outliers, in other words, is there anything that would challenge what I think to be, regarding this situation? Or am I starting to get a good understanding of these patterns and this experience that I'm seeking to examine? So remember, I'm trying to answer the question of why. So now, finally, after I think I have these 3 to 7 major themes or findings, then I choose how to represent the data. Often, I'll use some form of concept map or visual map in order to do this. So this is just one example where these larger circles could be the major themes or the grounded theory, okay? And then these smaller things could be codes and first order themes. But then these 5 things, or 2, 4, 6 factors are the themes that explain intrinsic motivation in physical education. Okay, so these are your major findings. These are your results right here in a qualitative study. Here's another example, and I've given you 3 or 4 examples that you can look through that are in the PowerPoint. Okay, but just a quick example here of what we looked at earlier, exploring team identity. So we have the transcripts in front of us. First, we develop codes. Then we try to explain these codes in more specific ways through processes, positive and negative, hazing process, team building process. Now finally, as I work back and forth among these codes and these larger themes, we figure out how to represent our major findings, okay? So this is just an example that I just came up with, okay? So basically, that didn't work, sorry. From those themes, I tried to visually represent this process of creating team identity. And for example, I might say, you know what? Team identity is an outcome that's dependent entirely upon the type of positive or negative experience that a student athlete has. And whether or not the student athlete has a positive or negative experience depends on these 3 things: the coaching staff, their peers, and their own view of this process, okay? For example, if the coaching staff presents it in a positive way and they do things like team building activities, then the student athlete perceives it as positive, and this leads to a positive team identity outcome. Versus if the peers present it in a negative hazing sort of way, and this student athlete perceives it as negatively as well, then the team identity outcome will be disintegration rather than cohesion. That was just a quick example, obviously it's made up, of how you might go from basic codes to higher level themes and then to a visual representation of what's going on in this team that I examined from a qualitative perspective, right? This is my purpose, to explore team identity in this particular college sport, and these are my major findings that I arrive at through the data analysis process. So, back to the lecture. You are now going to review these slides that I just went through, and then I will see you in Blackboard. You'll go into the group assignment, and then you will follow the directions according to the group that you signed up for. So again, there's a fitness group, there's views of the body group, and there's a leadership group. And I'll put your names inside each of those groups so that you'll know which group to participate in. Enjoy that assignment, and I will see you next week.